Thank you, Mark. Go ahead, Hannah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. So hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Hannah Risley-White. Again, I'm the Interstate Stream Commission Deputy Director. I should also say that I was previously the PECOS Basin Manager, and I see a number of PECOS folks on today. So shout out to my friends and colleagues on the PECOS. I want to also just thank Sarah and Mark and the team at U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for their support through the planning assistance to the states grant that Sarah just mentioned. It is a significant component of us pulling together this 50-year water plan together with a number of other partners, including New Mexico Water Resources Research Institute, Water Dialogue, New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources, and a number of other state agencies, in particular Indian Affairs Department that's heading up a tribal water working group to gather input for this plan. This challenge that we're facing in terms of climate change is really an all hands on deck effort. And so that's why we're really teaming with all the smart folks from around the state, including you all on today, to gather input on how to confront the challenges that we face ahead related to climate change. And so I'm just going to speak really briefly about what this plan is and what it intends to do, and then I'll hand it back over to Sarah. So the 50-year water plan is Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham's initiative to help New Mexico and New Mexicans prepare for climate change. It is intended to be based in science. So this slide sort of provides an outline of what will be in the report. So a summary of current sort of peer-reviewed science related to climate change in New Mexico and what those impacts will look like. And then identifying where we are resilient and where we are not. So where are we most vulnerable? Where do we need to focus our attention and do work? And what are the examples of resilience or efforts towards resilience throughout the state that we can learn from and replicate? And then importantly, the goal is to make recommendations. So this will be sort of a springboard to next steps, like what is it that we need to do? What do we need to take action on in order to prepare for the changes ahead? And so I guess you could go to the next slide. Oh, maybe just one more thing, Sarah. I want to stress that this is an executive summary level document. This is not an extensive, very long document. We've had a fairly tight time frame to do it in. But it's really intended to be something that decision makers or policymakers or local officials could pick up and in a quick amount of time get a sense of what it is that we're confronting with regards to climate change, and then be able to take action in their local communities. All right, next slide. Thanks, Sarah. So there's a number of ways of looking at resilience, and part of these webinars today hosted by U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is doing exactly that. Some of you may have participated in some of these webinars this week, in which case you've heard me say the same thing a few times. Some of you may also have participated in the series of webinars that Interstate Stream Commission hosted over the last several weeks related to resilience in a number of water use sectors. And so those sectors are outlined here on the slide. For those of you on the phone, we had sort of created for the purposes of this plan 5 sectors, being agriculture and livestock, public water systems and domestic wells, watersheds and habitat, industrial, commercial, mining and power water uses, and recreation and quality of life. And so if you missed those webinars and you're interested in them, they are posted on our website, as will be the recordings from this week. In addition, there are a number of surveys. There's 5 resilience assessment surveys related to those 5 sectors that are also posted on our website, and we very much encourage you all to participate in those. And so that was one way of looking at resilience based on sort of water use sector. Another way of looking at resilience has to do with looking at these 4 climatic regions that are the subject of the Army Corps' webinars this week. And those are really based on the idea from the science that those 4 regions will have sort of similar responses within those regions to the climatic changes that we're anticipating due to climate change. So that's where Sarah will go into more detail on that for the Eastern Plains region in just a moment. And you can go to the next slide. Thanks, Sarah. And so to just place this in the timeline here for everyone, as I said, it's been a fairly tight time frame on this plan. And I should stress, this is different than the other planning that we've ever done before at Interstate Stream Commission. We do regional water planning, and we also have a state water plan, which gets updated every 5 years. That was last updated in 2018 and will be updated again in 2023. So this hopefully will feed into that nicely. What's different here is that this plan really is just focused specifically on looking at the impacts of climate change to our water resources. We've never done that before, and really sort of getting all the smart folks together to think through how to confront those challenges. And that really kicked off with a partnership with the New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources. They convened an expert team of scientists who spend decades of time studying our landscapes and their reactions to water. And that expert panel produced what we're calling the Leap Ahead report. So it's really an analysis of all of the current peer-reviewed science related to climate change impacts to New Mexico. So not necessarily new research or new studies, but just evaluating everything that's out there and synthesizing it so that people can digest that. That report, that Leap Ahead, as we call it, is on our website. If you haven't seen it already, I very much encourage you to check that out. But it is not the 50-year plan itself. It will be included in the appendix, and sort of the key takeaways from that science foundation, which was what the governor really asked us to do with this 50-year plan, was to have it be based in science. That will be summarized in a more succinct way in the plan itself. And then we transitioned from there into a resilience assessment process, which is what I was just discussing, and part of what we're here to do today as well. And we encourage you again to take that survey. Will be on our website through November 30th. There's also a survey associated with this webinar, and Sarah will talk more about that later. We're now sort of transitioning into collecting more input related to adaptation strategy and recommendations to be included in the 50-year water plan. So what does the science say about what we're confronting, and then what are we going to do about it? So that's the purpose of 50-year plan. And you could go to the next slide, Sarah. And just to summarize again, sort of additional opportunities to plug in. This is the last of the 4 climatic region webinars hosted by U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We're then looking forward to a state water tribal forum that's being organized in part by Indian Affairs Department, as I mentioned earlier, and the Tribal Water Work Group that they've convened on November 19th. Please stay tuned to our website and to our email list. And if you don't get our emails, the email address is there on the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, and I'll post it a few times in the chat today as well. If you're on the phone, you can find that later on our website, or reach out over the phone. We can get you added. Through that email, we'll be updating folks on additional opportunities to chime in, specifically with regards to the recommendations section of the 50-year water plan. And then the last chance to sort of chime in as we're writing this plan will be at the annual water dialogue meeting, which is January 12th and 13th. If you haven't attended that before, I encourage you to, and in particular as part of this 50-year water planning effort, it's a great place to go and plug in as well. And there's information on this slide about how to register there. And then again, just to remind you all that these webinars are recorded and posted on our website. There's also multiple opportunities to chime in, either through the resilience assessment surveys, or there's a general comment box as well related to 50-year water plan on our website. And again, just this is certainly a challenge that we're facing that no single entity can solve alone. So it's going to take all of us coming together to find solutions, and that's part of what we're here to do today, is to start that conversation. So I'm glad to see all of you on. And with that, I'll hand it back to Sarah.
Thank you, Hannah. And Hannah will be on the call the rest of the day to answer questions and to be a part of the conversation dialogue at the end of this presentation that we'll have. So I know that there have been many presentations covering this topic, but in case this is anyone's first time joining a New Mexico 50-year water plan presentation, we're going to start with a brief overview of climate change in New Mexico. And so the ISC, all the webinars that they've held over the past few months, this is a summary slide from those presentations that discuss the big overview of climate change across New Mexico. And the final bullet on the page says that different regions of New Mexico will experience different impacts. And that is what we're here to discuss today. So it's important to note that I'm not going to cover everything on the slide for the Eastern Plains. However, everything on this slide still applies to the Eastern Plains region. I'm going to be covering the extremes or the impacts unique to the Eastern Plains. So for the purposes of the leap ahead analysis that Hannah had mentioned earlier and the New Mexico 50-year water plan, New Mexico was divided into 4 physiographic regions based on projected climate change and the associated effects on hydrology. So these 4 regions, which you see on the screen, they're defined by a combination of latitude and topography. They include the high mountains, the northwestern high desert, the Rio Grande Valley Basin and Range, and the Eastern Plains. And these regions, they represent a simplification of the 8 climate divisions that are defined by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. So when discussing the anticipated response to climate change in the 8 smaller regions, the authors of the Leap Ahead report, they found themselves repeating a lot of what they were writing. So to reduce this repetition, the regions were combined and simplified to the 4 regions that you see here. So obviously there's microclimates in each of these regions that may have more or less extreme responses to climate change, but overall they're going to trend in the same direction as the rest of the region. So let's get more specific and talk about the Eastern Plains. This region is designated as Climatic Region 4 in Leap Ahead report and will be also Climatic Region 4 in the New Mexico 50-year water plan. The Eastern Plains covers the eastern quarter of the state of New Mexico and stretches from the northern to the southern border of the state. And the whole area is pretty flat and is characterized by grasslands in the northern part and transitions to the Chihuahuan Desert in the south. The Eastern Plains includes 2 climatic divisions as defined by NOAA, the northeastern and the southeastern. And again, those have been combined in the New Mexico 50-year water plan. So in New Mexico, temperature increases have been increasing by more than 2 degrees Fahrenheit in the past 50 years. On that same note, the freeze-free season, or that growing season, which is the time between the last frost in the spring and the first frost in the fall, it's approximately 2 weeks longer on average now than it was in the 1960s and 70s. If we take a look at future climate change models, we can see different emission scenarios represented, like in the images you're seeing now on the screen. Emission scenarios are possible pathways that society may take in the emission of greenhouse gases in the future. And when looking at temperature, model projections indicate that surface temperatures in New Mexico will warm substantially over the 21st century, no matter which emission scenario you're looking at. The same can be said for the Pecos Basin, which is located within the Eastern Plains. In this document, or this figure that you're seeing at the bottom, is from the recent Bureau of Reclamation 2021 Pecos River Basin study that was just put out and is a great document to look at for understanding the Pecos River in the region. Overall, this projected temperature increase is going to look something like the climate of Albuquerque at the end of the 21st century, being similar to 20th century climate of El Paso, Texas. So both those locations receive roughly the same amount of precipitation, but El Paso is considerably warmer. Think about what this means for ecosystems. You can compare that vegetation growing now in the Sandia Mountains near Albuquerque with what grows in the Franklin Mountains outside of El Paso. So temperature increases across the state, they're going to have cascading effects. For example, warming temperatures are expected to reduce the accumulation of snow during the winter and the availability of snow melt to sustain runoff during the warmer seasons. Average annual snowmelt runoff over the past 30 years into the Pecos River has been approximately 50,000 to 60,000 acre feet. As the climate warms, precipitation falls less as snow and more as rain. And more of the snow that does build up melts during the winter rather than during that spring snowmelt period. So this decreases snowpack, or that amount of snow that accumulates over the winter to melt in the spring. So since the 1950s, snowpack has been decreasing in New Mexico, as shown in this image that's depicted on your screen. This is showing snowpack at the headwaters of the Rio Grande on top with a green line. The date April 1st, that's historically been representative of maximum snowpack. And looking at the figure, we can see snowpack, again shown at the top in green, on April 1st. It varies a lot from year to year, and that has to do with the precipitation fluctuations. But overall, snowpack on April 1st is exhibiting a long-term downward trend since 1950. And changes in peak snowmelt timing are also predicted to occur up to 1 to 3 weeks earlier across New Mexico. So this consensus, there is consensus that there's only earlier onset of snowmelt driven stream flow and lower snowmelt in general has already been observed in the Rio Grande Basin and the Pecos Basin. Let's talk about precipitation really quickly. So in New Mexico, precipitation is heavily influenced by the natural fluctuations of the Pacific Ocean temperatures, like the El Nino cycle, and land surface heating during the summer. And we all know the importance of the North American monsoon season and how it brings much needed rain to the region. However, in New Mexico, what drives that strength and intensity of those monsoon events, that's not well understood. I do want to note, though, and especially for this region, it's been widely documented around the world that increases in atmospheric temperatures have resulted in extreme rainfall event increases. But again, how this affects the monsoon here in the North American region, that's not well understood. So thunderstorms are common in the Eastern Plains, and even though New Mexico has had very few recorded tornadoes, most that have been recorded occurred in the Eastern Plains. If an increase in extreme precipitation events does occur across the state, and this is regardless of a change in total precipitation, the Eastern Plains will be the most strongly impacted part of New Mexico. So if we look at model projections for precipitation on an annual statewide basis, we do not find a clear or significant trend in future precipitation. However, if we take a look at projections by seasonality, like what you see on the screen, we do start to see trends in future precipitation. So when you look at the figure on the slide, darker green is increasing precipitation and darker brown is decreasing precipitation. In winter, which is shown in the top left quadrant, winter frontal systems, they move eastward off the Pacific Ocean, and they tend to begin to track further north on average. So the southern part of the state exhibits a tendency towards less precipitation, while the northern mountains tend to receive somewhat more. And this sounds like it would be a win for snowpack, but due to increased temperatures, more precipitation in the winter will fall as rain compared to historic precipitation trends. And the snowpack is going to have to battle evapotranspiration increases, which we'll discuss in a second, as well as drier springs, which is shown in the top right, and increased dust from across the state, which we'll also discuss a bit later. The spring season in the top right image, that exhibits a general statewide drying trend. For much of the state, spring is already the driest season of the year. So the trend toward less spring precipitation combined with hotter temperatures, that represents a clear trend toward increasing aridity. Now, summer precipitation is shown in the lower left quadrant, and that includes a trend towards stronger monsoon precipitation in the southwest corner of the state. However, it also shows less precipitation in the northeast. And that latter feature, which is so clear on the image, that's part of a more general geographical trend toward drier summers in central North America. And again, that makes up a large portion of the Eastern Plains. The trend in autumn precipitation averaged is generally small. There's some tendency for increasing precipitation in the southwest. So this is coming from a trend in spring dryness and autumn wetness. And that's because there's a projected tendency for the monsoon season to actually shift in its dates and shift later. So it'll shift later starting and then also end later into the fall. So for a climate as arid as New Mexico's, there's two flows that strongly dominate the water budget, and that's precipitation and evapotranspiration. We've already discussed precipitation in the previous slides, and here we're going to discuss that evapotranspiration. The image on this slide is showing the average annual water budget for New Mexico, and the numbers show the amount of water in millions of acre feet per year. So evapotranspiration has been divided into evaporation and transpiration, and temperature plays a big role in both of these. As temperatures increase, evaporation increases because there's a higher amount of energy available to convert the liquid water to water vapor. Transpiration increases because as temperatures warm, plants open up their stomata and release more water vapor. So overall, warming temperatures plus a longer growing season all increases evapotranspiration. So due to increasing temperatures across the state, we know that evapotranspiration is going to increase. And this map on the slide shows the change in potential evapotranspiration across New Mexico by mid-century compared to late 20th century. Potential evapotranspiration is a measure of how much water would evaporate over a large area covered with uniform vegetation, and if there's unlimited water available at the surface. So the estimate of changes in potential evapotranspiration are driven by the temperature and the precipitation changes already discussed. And this suggests that the average annual value of potential evapotranspiration will be 3 to 9 inches higher by mid-century relative to its late 20th century values. So because potential evapotranspiration rates are high and they're only going to get higher as temperatures increase, they're going to offset any possible precipitation increases that may or may not happen. Therefore, available water resources and soil moisture levels are projected to decline over the 21st century and beyond. All of this is going to be leading to increased aridity and soil moisture loss across the state. And with drier soils, there will be more dust. We've already discussed snowpack, but it's important to note that dust is detrimental to snowpack because instead of snow being white and being able to reflect the sun, it gets covered in dust, making it a darker color, thus absorbing the sun's energy and accelerating snowmelt. Another aspect of all this drying will be reduced infiltration into aquifers, and increasing evapotranspiration and temperature will lead to further plant, especially tree, stress, and can increase disease and beetle kill. And we're already starting to see a lot of those factors occur at our high elevation locations. So all of these factors, these increasing temperatures, reduced soil moisture, abundant fuel sources in the form of dead and dying vegetation, that increases wildfire risk. So let's talk one more time about the biggest issue for this region, and that's this increasing aridity. Although the average temperature increase over much of the eastern plains, it's actually projected to be roughly a degree lower than the rest of the state average. But again, it's still increasing. The evapotranspiration rates, however, are likely to be some of the highest in the state, these increases in evapotranspiration. And this is a result of projected decreases in precipitation during the spring and summer. And that's whenever evapotranspiration is already the highest. And so given that this major aquifer in this region has already undergone major depletion, the lower availability of surface water related to increasing aridity, that's going to present a major challenge. Another aspect is this relatively flat topography of the eastern plains. Some of the most dramatic climate-related impacts will be related to vegetation and soils. The dry lands of eastern New Mexico are dominated by soils that are especially vulnerable to wind when subjected to extended losses in vegetation. The response of spatially extensive regions of eastern and south central New Mexico over the next 50 years to climate and environmental change is most likely desertification, accompanied by a significant increase in dust emissions, as well as increased erosion on hill slopes, all of which is going to impact water supply, water quality, and water demand. So what does all this mean for the human connection with water in the eastern plains? At this point, I want to stop doing all the talking, and I want to hear from the participants that are on the call. We want to have a dialogue about this. What does it mean for people that are living on the Eastern Plains. And Dan's already started us off, but again, please feel free to use the chat. You can also raise your hand beside your name and come off mute, and we can have a discussion. So Dan asked what technical reasoning basis was used to combine both northern and southern portions of this area as identified by NOAA into a single study area. And I'm going to give it a second because I'm not sure if one of the authors is on from the Leap Ahead report, but if not, I can also answer that. Don't see. I will say that the reasons for combining them, they originally, and they did struggle with this Eastern Plains section as whether or not to leave it, but what they were writing was basically the same for both regions. In the north, it may have been slightly more extreme or slightly less extreme versus the south, or the south may have been slightly more extreme or slightly less extreme in terms of temperature changes. But overall, there's a north-south gradient that's all trending in the same direction. Jay says it curbs development and lenders' willingness to lend. Do you mean in the region? And I don't know if you'd like to address that one as well.
I'm not sure. Is that you, Jerry? If you're on, you can unmute and say more about what you were writing.
No, just the scarcity of water, it curbs development. And when there's such dire forecasting, it may curb people's willingness to lend money to farmers and such.
Yeah, I think just to respond to that, thanks, Jerry. You know, certainly one of the concerns coming from the governor and her staff is that we need to be planning and preparing for this so that we can ensure continued economic development. So what that looks like, you know, is part of figuring this out. But I think there's certainly serious concerns for New Mexico and much of the Southwest with regards to water resources, given the climate projections that we're all seeing.
There's a second comment also from Jerry that says, yes, the PFAS contamination is all the more important to clean up the groundwater.
Very true. Good point, Jerry. Thank you.
Kurt asked, what are the principal uses of groundwater on the Southeast? Domestic, agriculture, industrial, commercial?
So there's probably folks on from the Roswell-Artesian Basin. It's a significant ag area of the state, one of the biggest sort of economic drivers in terms of ag in the state, and irrigates over 100,000 acres from groundwater in the Roswell-Artesian area. So that's a significant use of groundwater. And then, as you all know, there's been quite a lot of oil and gas production in the Permian Basin and southeast New Mexico. So there is also, you know, water demand for those operations, as well as municipal and other industrial uses in the Pecos. But I'd be happy for other folks who are, since there's a lot of Pecos folks on, to jump in and chime in as well.
I see from Kurt Anderson asking about surface water. The Carlsbad Irrigation District primarily relies on surface water for their agricultural uses as well.
Thank you for that. I was going to say John Holly has his hand up. You can go ahead and come off mute if you'd like.
We can't hear you if you're talking, John, but I'm sure glad you made it on. I know you were trying to get on this morning, had trouble, so it's good to see you.
Oh, I can hear you now.
What, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I during my first 15 years in this region, I worked for the Soil Survey Division of the Soil Conservation Service, now NRCS. And one of my more interesting assignments, other than the many years I was in Las Cruces, was 3 years up on the high plains. We were stationed at Texas Tech because that was the closest area, but our area included everything from Clayton, included the Pecos, but we were concentrating on dust, on how to control, how to keep West Texas and eastern New Mexico and southeast Colorado from returning to dust bowl conditions that were most recently in the 1950s, and then of course in the 30s and the 20s, late 20s. But so we did a lot of, and what you learn, and what I don't want to say much, but there's a different population, there's a different mindset on the high plains. You just have to, once you get north from Hobbs north to Roosevelt County to Clayton, it's a totally different population of people who came out to mine groundwater to grow crops, and they were very successful. And so I'd love to hear, in the short time you have left today, hear from people who have boots on the ground experience in that part of the world.
Thanks.
Thank you for that, John.
And I agree. I'd love to hear from any of those folks who are on today. And then maybe I just noticed that Rick Young from Reclamation posted in the chat about their purchases of water for threatened and endangered species. And I think this is certainly this balancing act that we're looking at in all of these regions is, you know, how to meet Endangered Species Act obligations and ensure our habitat and riparian ecosystems, and all of the water uses, you know, for people with a diminishing supply, right? So it feels like a puzzle to try to figure out. And anyone who wants, you're welcome to unmute yourself and comment if you'd like, or just use the chat. Either way is fine.
And you also don't have to ask a question. You can also just comment something that you would like to have recorded as a part of this outreach effort. Dan Davis has added that groundwater doesn't really clean up. It often takes decades at best. You need to protect the aquifer, prevent bad things from happening to it.
This is Walter Bradley, and you might answer some of your irrigation in the northern part of your panel there. Go to ogallalawater.org. That's a recent 5-year study on the Ogallala, all the way from New Mexico to Nebraska, and that'll give you some insight as to what has happened and what is projected to happen. It's quite a lengthy document. It was put together by about 8 different universities and experts throughout that area.
Thank you for that resource. Rick has also added that Reclamation manages the block releases of water from Santa Rosa and Sumner to Brantley for the CID irrigation district. And Lori would like for someone to talk about the future population estimates in this region.
So I just posted in the chat, I think the website that was just mentioned looks like an interesting one. I haven't checked it out yet, so thank you for that. And then, you know, Lori, we haven't done as part of this 50-year plan population projections for 50-year water plan, but there was consideration of population projections, I believe, in the last state water plan update, or maybe it was the regional plans. And as I recall, and others should chime in here, there was, you know, some projected growth in the cities and in the southeast corner where there's increasing industry, and then projected decline in population in some of the more rural areas, which is part of the trend that we're seeing elsewhere. But others here could probably speak to that better than I could.
Kurt Anderson has said that he'd love to see some numbers. What are the surface and groundwater budgets, say in acre feet per year for the Pecos watershed, and can they be directed to a source?
I mean, I think a good place to start might be to look at that Pecos Basin study that Sarah mentioned earlier, that was recently completed by Reclamation with assistance from us and others from the region. And then I don't know if others have recommendations besides some of the other, you know, state water plans, like the Lower Pecos Valley Regional Plan would probably be another good one to look at. I believe that was completed in 2017.
Hannah, I had a question.
Yeah. Hey, Wade.
Hi. I kind of missed, I guess, a little bit something you said something earlier about the 50-year plan being more of an executive summary type of plan. Is that, could you expound on that just a little bit and how that relates to our different regions?
Sure. So I think that I've been really trying to, there's been a lot of questions and interest in 50-year water plan, which is great. And as with any time you talk about water plans, I feel like you could get 10 people in the room and talk about a plan and everyone has a different idea of what the word plan means. It's kind of like if you get people together and talk about water banking or other things that can be interpreted multiple ways. So I've been trying to do some expectation setting, clarifying in some of these talks in terms of what we're actually producing here. And so when I say executive summary level document, originally the plan was for this document to be between 30 and 50 pages. So really not digging into the weeds too extensively in the regions or, you know, in some of the summary of say the scientific data, although the appendix will probably be quite significant. So like the whole Leap Ahead report, which is over 200 pages, would be in the appendix. There'll probably be more detailed information related to the resilience assessment work we just did in the appendix. But the plan itself, the 50-year water plan, is really intended to be something that decision makers or other folks who don't necessarily have time to spend a lot of time on a lengthy report could pick something up and sort of in a few moments or in less than an hour sort of get a snapshot of what we're looking at in terms of climate change. We're still sort of sorting out what will be in the appendix. I definitely want there to be plenty of stuff for folks who want to get into the weeds and really dig in more, to have those resources available to them. And as far as you all in the specific regions, there will be some discussion about sort of the anticipated impacts in these 4 climate regions that were delineated by the Leap Ahead panelists. But again, it probably won't go into a lot of detail. But what I would say there is, and this came up in our webinar earlier this morning as well. I think, you know, right now I'm doing a lot of thinking about, well, what comes out of the 50-year plan? Like, what is the next step, right? So I think really what we're trying to do is use this to leverage resources for the actions that need to be taken next. So really to raise awareness, kind of use this as a call to action almost. And then have a really good recommendations section in the plan that people can look to that would speak to next steps. And one of those next steps, in my opinion, and this is me personally, but I think colleagues at ISC and others through this planning process have raised this repeatedly, would be to provide resources back to the regions, whether that's the 16 planning regions or other regional groups or areas or communities, to support them in making management decisions about the resources that they share. And so I don't know quite what that looks like, but I would love if the state had, like a little technical team, or I don't know if it's a grant program or what, but to provide to communities across the state the resources that they would need to come together to start developing solutions. And probably some of that would start with resources to help you all better understand the resources that you manage. So what's the existing data that's out there? What are the data gaps and what's needed to fill them, and looking to you all for that and supporting in finding that information. And then what kind of, say, hydrologic modeling or other analysis do you all need to support you in your decision making? And then what else is needed for those community groups to develop solutions, whether that's facilitation or communication skills to get the word out, or maybe legal advice, or I'm not sure what all. Right now, we don't really have the capacity to do that. The ISU's planning program is 2 people and a $300,000 a year budget. But certainly there's been a lot of discussion, and I've been trying to work at identifying what are the other options, what are the other funding. There's a lot of federal funding coming into New Mexico right now. So how do we pull together the resources that would be needed on some of the next steps coming out of 50-year water plan, and how does 50-year water plan really help us leverage those? And then the question of what is it that we then are able to offer out to communities across the state who really want to start developing solutions in their areas. So I don't know if that's helpful, Wade. That was a very long answer to your question.
Wow. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, this morning I was listening into the meeting this morning, and representative that was on there was asking, what can they do? And I kept thinking, well, they could legislatively, they could provide some funding for the interstate stream for this type of thing, be a little bit more generous with funding for these type of things. I mean, I'm gathering that, interstate stream is kind of struggling to have manpower and funds to move forward with this even. So, it's just one of them things I think ought to be mentioned.
Thanks, Wade.
Before we continue with the dialogue, and we can go as long as everybody wants, but I do want to be cognizant of everyone's time really quick and just mention a few other things, which is we would like to answer this question: how can the Eastern Plains increase water resilience? And you just heard Hannah mention that the Interstate Stream Commission, they cannot answer this question by themselves. It's just a few people in a room, and we really want to get ideas from across the state, from across expertise to add to this New Mexico 50-year water plan. And you can actually answer this question by completing, well, we can do it here in the chat. You can come off mute, but you can also do the Climatic Regions survey. It's very short. There's only a zip code required. And then that final question asks for ideas if you're already a part of a water resilience project in your community, if you've had an idea for your community for a while and you'd like to get it off the ground. That's what we want to see and hear, are those ideas, especially for the Eastern Plains and across New Mexico in general. I'm going to put a link to the survey in the chat so that you can get to it, and I will now get back to the conversation. Rick mentioned that the storm that hit Carlsbad at the end of June this year is an example of the possibility for extreme precipitation events into the future. And also that Reclamation's Water Smart grants can fund some of these planning efforts. So thanks for that. And then, Hannah, I don't know if you want to address Alec.
Oh, I was just thanking him for Alex took on his toes. He pulled some information about census data that he posted in the chat. So he's saying that all counties in the region except Eddy, Lee, and Curry have declined in population in the last decade. So thanks for that, Alex. And then Rick Young also posted in the chat that the storm that hit Carlsbad at the end of June this year is an example of the possibility for extreme precipitation events, and that Reclamation's Water Smart grants can fund some of these planning efforts. Awesome, thank you, Rick. In fact, I have on my list of to-dos to talk more to Yvette McKenna in your shop. But I think your point about the extreme events is a good one. And on the Pecos in particular, you know, we're seeing what we were seeing across the West, which is decreased snowpack. So we're less able to store water in the high mountains. But then these occasional very high intensity precipitation events that cause flooding or that quickly fill reservoirs. And so it definitely, for water managers, makes us think about, you know, how do we manage things different given that change in circumstance, right?
There was a hand up in the participants list, but I think they put it down. If you'd like to come off mute and still comment or ask a question, please do.
I still have one hand up.
Oh,
Okay. One thing, I'm so glad that somebody mentioned tornadoes. We don't think about that, but if you live in Hobbs or Roosevelt County, tornadoes are a real. If you live in places just across the line in West Texas, they're a fact of life, and so you can see a large city like Lubbock devastated in a 4-hour period by a tornado with a 10-story building just twisted like a matchstick. And these extreme precipitation events are when you're on the high plains, you suddenly you talk about things like blue northers, where there's an Arctic front coming down the east side of the Rocky Mountains, and the temperature goes from like a balmy 60, 70 degrees to maybe 10 degrees or even 0. So you're seeing, or you'll see a Gulf hurricane like the Carlsbad event, where you'll see an area with an average precipitation or 10 or 15 inches go to a town like Lubbock who get from 18 average to 40 inches in some years. So it's a different world out there, and you see it on the satellite imagery. And I just want to bring one small case study. One of the problems with the 4 climate region model is that Eastern Plains is like 5 or 6 climate regions in itself, microclimate. And as Stephanie mentioned, it's about 4 or 5 more administrative units as far as the state engineer and Interstate Stream Commission go. So there I'd suggest you look at Water Resources Institute Technical Completion Report 335. It's a study of potential water salvage on the Tucumcari project, Arch Hurley Conservation District. they took a piece out of my mouth when they did a cancer operation. So I apologize for my ability to speak. But I will also do have ability to shut up, which I'll do. But I suggest you look at that because that covers the whole watershed from just north of Las Vegas, Mora, the whole Canadian and the Conchos watershed, and how the impacts that on Conchos Reservoir, on Ute Reservoir in the Mexico, and then on the downstream on the reservoirs north on the Canadian north of Amarillo. And one of the problems with using those rivers, that Canadian drainage, to extract water from reservoirs in that drainage and pump them up to 1,000 feet, lift up to the high plains for any kind of use, such as the Ute River project, is that those reservoirs are even more vulnerable than Conchos, than Elephant Butte or the reservoirs on the upper Colorado and our precious San Juan diversion project that diverts water to Albuquerque. Those reservoirs are really in desperate straits. So I've taken over my time, but that one report, technical report 335, it has Phil King as an author, myself, John Hernandez, and the former state engineer Elude Martinez. All of us joined together to work on that project for the Arch Hurley irrigation district out of Tucumcari.
Thanks for that, John. I've never looked at that report and I'd love to, so appreciate you chiming in on that.
Also, I want to point out that, John, what you mentioned about the Eastern Plains needing to be further divided, that's the kind of feedback that we also want to hear for the 50-year water plan, or even for the leap ahead analysis. If there was something that should have been in the document or should have been a part of it or considered, that's stuff that we can continue to work on and work towards even after the 50-year water plan. Hannah had said early on that this is supposed to be a springboard document for more action. And that's what we hope it will be. Let's see, there's been a lot in the chat. Hannah, I don't know if you've been keeping up with it and have an answer for some of this, or I can just start at the top of where I think we're at.
I guess one that stands out to me is from Jerry here about USR underground storage and recovery project in this region. And I think, Jerry, I've heard quite a fair bit of discussion about that in the PECOS, but is certainly something that warrants more discussion. I mean, as we're working on this plan, it's clear that we're going to be losing a lot of water to evap from our reservoirs. So to what extent can we be exploring opportunities to store water underground or increase, recharge in key areas or whatever does seem critical. So thank you for that. And maybe you could speak more to the NMED discharge permit issue than I could, if you want to, Jerry.
Oh, it's just difficult. USR is difficult because no matter what type of water you're using, flood water, treated effluent, river water, it has to be clean to drinking water standards before you can put it in the aquifer. And just recently, in the most recent discharge permit, they're now asking them to look in their effluent for PFAS. And I'm thinking, great, now that's going to kill the ability to even use reclaimed effluent unless it's treated for that. And the municipalities are taking a huge burden. The testing is outrageously expensive, let alone treatment.
Thank you, Jerry. That helps clarify for folks quite a bit. And I think part of the conversation that we've engaged in over the last couple of months, and I assume will continue over the next few months, is sort of what are the potential policy changes that might be needed in order to support some of these solutions. And so if there's something that we think could be a very productive thing to implement, and yet there's some incentives that are not in place or barriers that are problematic, like how do we look at that more carefully to adjust those things to enable the solutions that are being developed. And so certainly we'll be looking for that kind of input, as Sarah was saying, to be considered in terms of the recommendation section in this plan.
Thank you, everyone. I've put the link to that survey once again in the chat. If you would like to add ideas on how the Eastern Plains can increase water resilience, Hannah is going to add some more links to be able to connect with the ISC and to continue the dialogue on how to increase water resilience. I will say thank you so much for joining us. I know it's afternoon on a Friday, but this is a really important topic, and we've had such great participation all week from all 4 regions, and this was, again, a great conversation to end on with a group of people that really care about this issue, because it's something that probably everyone across New Mexico should care about. Most definitely. Hannah, would you like to say anything?
No, just really to thank everybody who's on today, and some of you have participated in a number of these events. We appreciate your engagement. Please help spread the word. And we look forward to continuing this discussion with you all and developing next steps.